Did you know that there is more Sangiovese planted in Italy than there are South African vines in the entire South African winelands? There are more than 100,000 hectares of Sangiovese in Italy alone, and it's currently roughly 7th on the list of most widely planted red cultivars in the world. Now, the relevance of all this is that today's Hand Drink Solo Wine info video focuses on Morgenster's Rigoletto Sangiovese 2022, which is made by winemaker Giulio Bertrand, who, if you haven't met her, is an absolute gargantuan chemistry nerd of the most epic and exciting way possible. In the old world, every established grape cultivar has a textbook answer as to what it's supposed to taste like. For example, one prominent answer as to what Sangiovese should taste like will have notes of roasted tomato, oregano, sweet balsamic, espresso, and even sour cherry. But in the case of Sangiovese specifically, there will always be the proviso that says Sangiovese can change drastically from region to region, which means that for Sangio in particular, the textbook answer is more often wrong than it is right. Now, we mentioned how Sangio can change from region to region, but to complicate matters worse, there are new clones developed all the time which have even greater examples of sensory change. In fact, some of the more recently developed clones are delivering wines that are almost unrecognizable, even to wine critics and sensory panel professionals.
You didn't recognize me, did you?
In fact, exactly one such panel sat recently drinking what they had assumed to be Sangiovese Merlot blends because the wines were rich and rounded. The truth of the matter is that they were drinking 100% Sangiovese wines, but these wines had been made with newer clones that delivered far plusher, more fruit-forward wines than perhaps the more tannic, angular, savory, herbal beasties of yesteryear. With regards to these new clones, institutions like Fondazione Banfi in fact catalog these clones as they are produced, and each one gets its own fancy little name, and then it gets a series of rankings related to each element of its sensory profile. One of these points of ranking is typicity, or how Sangiovese-ish it might be. So we can take a clone like BF30, which is very highly regarded, even though it scores really low on its typicity scoring. Now, it scores low because it delivers intense, rich color, which is very unlike Sangiovese.
What does it all mean, Basil?
Today's Morgenster Rigoletto Sangiovese is made with two very different clones that are then blended in the cellar. The first one is clone R24, which winemaker Yolandi tells us delivers very big berries on very big bunches, and it tastes full of juicy red fruit, but it also delivers low intensity color. The second clone that they work with is an older clone called SG3, which has smaller berries, thicker skins, has a higher ratio of skin to fruit pulp, and as a result, it delivers a wine with far more intense color, but also bigger structure and slightly more herbal, brooding, savory elements. Okay, so now that we know that from region to region, Sangiovese can differ dramatically, and from clone to clone, Sangiovese can differ dramatically. So let's toss any textbook answer out the window as to what Sangiovese should taste like, and instead, let's focus on what this Sangiovese tastes like. The nose on this guy is intensely primary in that almost all the aromas I smell feel as if they come directly from the grape itself, as opposed to perhaps oak or yeast or maturation. And this makes total sense because it's a 2022 wine, it's exceedingly young. But the nose that we do get carries waves and waves of cherry and strawberry and toffee apple candy and even watermelon. Now at this point, you might be forgiven for thinking that you're sniffing a Cinsault. I say you'd be forgiven, but you'd still be wrong, because finally towards the end of those fruit notes, you get a hint of more savory leather and perhaps a touch of dried herbs. And this really is a clue to what's coming on the palate. When we give it a sip, well, I guess you know you're not in Kansas anymore, because straight out the gate there's this delightful, bright, juicy shot of sour cherry, which immediately brings balance to the sweeter strawberry which is on the palate, which we also smelt on the nose. The structure on the wine is also quite impressive, which might have taken you by surprise if you'd made the mistake of predicting tannin levels by looking at the color of the wine. Incidentally, with Italian wines, or even wines made from Italian cultivars, color and the intensity or structure of a wine often seem highly uncorrelated. Two of the obvious examples are Nebbiolo and Sangiovese, which have high structure and yet are often much lighter in color. One of the reasons for this is that most dark, rich colored wines have a dominant anthocyanin called MALVIDIN and lesser quantities of something called CYANIDIN, whereas Nebbiolo and Sangiovese actually have more of the cyanidin color, and Nebbiolo even has a bit of peonidin. Now, these colors are not as stable and often can suffer oxidation more quickly, and the end result is a wine that appears to have a less intense color. But enough distraction, back to the wine in the glass. The structure of this particular wine is quite important because we've spoken about cherries and strawberries and perhaps even some pomegranates and lush mulberry notes. And these could all sound like a little bit of fruit punch, but because there is the structure there, it holds it all in place and gives it an air of seriousness. Finally, on the tail, there's another element that helps this impression, and that's the ever so subtle hint of dried herbs, which is perhaps just a tip of the cap to the more old school Sangiovese style in what is otherwise a very modern new world take on the grape. When it comes to talking about how the wine was made, we need to remember that we made a lot of reference to primary fruit flavors with almost no mention of oak at all. This again makes total sense when we learn that this wine doesn't ever sit in barrel for longer than 4 months and is often less than that. Interestingly, according to winemaker Yolandi, the reason for the barrel time is not at all to impart any sort of oak presence, but rather to allow some of the oak tannins to be leached into the wine, and these oak tannins enable the anthocyanin colorants in the wine to be more stable. So, if nothing else, the wine goes into oak in order to help stabilize the color. And for those of you who love to geek out on yeast a little bit, Yolandi used 2 very different yeast strains to ferment this fruit for 2 very different reasons. The first product she used is called Bravo by Renaissance. It's a yeast designed specifically for fermenting very high tannin grapes like Nebbiolo or Petit Verdot or Cabernet Sauvignon. What it does is boosts glycerol production in a wine. Now, glycerol doesn't directly affect mouthfeel because it always exists below the human perception threshold in wine, but through a number of indirect mechanisms, it can affect the way we perceive tannins, and it can give the impression of a wine being softer or more rounded. What glycerol also does is it can boost the perception of sweetness, which takes notes like strawberry or cherry and holds a sensory magnifying glass over them in order to make them seem more prominent. The second product that Yolandi uses is called Brio, also by Renaissance, and it's designed to just generally boost the aromatic properties in a wine. And if you give this wine another sniff, you'll see that it did its job just fine. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you have any questions about this wine or about Sangiovese in general, then leave a comment on the website and I will try and get back to you. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon or subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish 6 videos each month talking about wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars coming out of the unique South African winelands.